Did y'all really think I had exhausted everything I had to say about the Second Doctor in my billion-video-long crusade back during Troughton month? Sweet summer child of mine, no. I want to talk about his appearances in multi-Doctor stories. Real talk, this was actually a video idea I had planned for Troughton month itself, but then fellow Universal member Ben decided to review the two Doctors, and I didn't want to step on his toes. But considering he didn't really say anything about how the Second Doctor himself was characterised in that video, yeah, I think it's still fair game for me to capitalise on this topic. So I think it's a fair assessment to say that multi-Doctor stories have a tendency to over-exaggerate the returning iterations of the character. Whether the reason is, I don't know, a writer's warped memory or askew interpretation of the past incarnation, or if it's a deliberate storytelling choice to highlight what distinguishes them from the incumbent actor, either way, the result is often a somewhat over-the-top, surface-level, self-referential encapsulation of the returning Doctor. Stephen Moffat's multi-Doctor writing serves us good examples of this. Just take a look at eyebrow-raisingly bitter, no fun allowed Fifth Doctor.
It really would help if there wasn't some skinny idiot ranting in my face about every single thing that happens to be in front of him.
Indignant, full of himself Casanova 10th Doctor.
Compensating? For what? Regeneration, it's a lottery.
And extremely senile, politically incorrect dinosaur First Doctor.
Well, aren't all ladies made of glass? In a way.
But as established, he's far from the only writer to have done this, and I think analysing the Second Doctor's appearances in multi-Doctor stories gives us a good insight into this phenomenon. So as long-term fans of the channel may already know, the Second Doctor as portrayed by Patrick Troughton is my favourite version of the Doctor. I have a whole video exploring why if you want to go check that out, but if I were to give you a bite-sized summary of the traits I value in his character, he's an impish, paranoid, highly rebellious advocate for justice and strongly opposes the suppression of individuality or free will, and he will undermine any dictatorial regime he encounters with often spontaneous underhanded tactics, particularly by exaggerating his bumbling dishevelled anxiety to lower their guard. There's more I could go into, but that's the core of this specific incarnation for me, and honestly it's kind of impressive how consistently this modus operandi is stuck to throughout the multiple creative handovers behind the scenes. He still does evolve over time, of course. He becomes progressively more outgoing and familial as time goes on, but the fact that the core of his character remains so remarkably stable while passing through the hands of so many people like Inez Lloyd, Jerry Davis, Victor Pemberton, Peter Bryant, Terrence Dix, and Derek Sherwin, as well as Troughton himself throwing in his own ad-libs and characteristics for good measure, well, that surely bodes well for his appearances in multi-Doctor stories, right? Surely he must be an easy personality to creatively grasp. So, let's take a look at these Second Doctor multi-Doctor appearances then, shall we? First up, we have The Three Doctors, Doctor Who's 10th anniversary celebratory serial, which began airing 11 months earlier. So by the skin of their teeth, the production team were able to get all three actors who had portrayed the Doctor at that point involved in this epic universe-threatening narrative where they face off against a formative yet malevolent figure in Gallifreyan history inside a black hole. Decent premise, a bit grandiose, but that's to be expected from such a special occasion. Apparently Jamie was considered to return as well to accompany the Second Doctor here, but this didn't pan out and his intended dialogue was given to Sergeant Benton instead. So that's the state of affairs in this serial. But of course, the big question is, how is the Second Doctor handled in it? Well, it's interesting. You see, in my dedicated video on the Second Doctor, I put forward an analysis of how he evolves throughout his own era. I concluded that in Season 4 he's more reserved and distant from those around him, determined to play his cards close to his chest. In Season 5, he is forced to open up more as a supportive parental figure to meet the needs of the orphaned Victoria, while in Season 6 he becomes even more outgoing as he partakes in a banterous family dynamic with Jamie and Zoe. In line with this perspective, I see his depiction in The Three Doctors to be the answer to the question, how unrestrained would he have become had he stayed on for Season 7? I'm serious, this might be the most extroverted official depiction of the Second Doctor really ever.
And you turned up and he started treating me like an imposter.
Well, you are, really, aren't you?
What do you mean?
Well, I suppose in another way we both are. Or is it neither of us?
Look, for heaven's sake, stop twittering on.
His bumbling clownish comedy is very exaggerated here, particularly with a lot of antics concerning his protectiveness of his recorder.
Are we going to take this attitude to my music all the time?
Yes, frankly, we are.
Oh, no, not my recorder.
As well as a lot of light-hearted tension and bickering in his interactions with both the Third Doctor and the Brigadier, the latter of whom is also extremely over-the-top here as well. It's odd, and to be honest, I'm not exactly sure how to feel about it. It is entertaining, it's sharply witty, and some good laughs are to be had.
If only I could find my recorder, I could play you a little something to pass the time.
We must be thankful for small mercies.
But at the same time, I do also feel like it's selling a rather surface-level cartoony representation of his Doctor, which backs up my earlier claim concerning multi-Doctor stories as a whole. This just so happens to be Patient Zero. Again, perhaps this is a deliberate creative choice, whether by Troughton himself, or writers Bob Baker and Dave Martin, or script editor Terence Dix, to emphasise the difference between incarnations and highlight how straight-faced the Third Doctor can be by comparison. I can only theorise. That's not to say that it's necessarily out of character per se. In fact, in the confrontations with Omega, the Second Doctor acting like a naive buffoon makes complete sense, and he's even self-aware about it, making a point of deliberately undermining Omega's superiority.
You wrangle and babble of pipe! It's not a pipe!
What the hell do you think you're trying to do? Testing the limits of his self-control. They're not very good, are they?
But in some of the other scenes, I wish this behaviour was reined in a little bit. The Second Doctor is more than just slapstick and shouting, "Oh my giddy aunt!" and I don't think this portrayal is as particularly nuanced as it could have been. But again, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad portrayal. Pat himself is as good as ever with the material, slipping back into the role like he had never been away, and his chemistry with Pertwee, Katie Manning, John Levine, really everyone on set is as sharp as ever. And as I said, parts of it work well, in fact far more than not. I just think the overall direction is odd. Though speaking of odd, this story does bring up a strange timeline discrepancy. So, if during his own entire era, the Second Doctor was so elusive that the Time Lords genuinely couldn't track him down, to the point where he had to deliberately give himself up for them to find and execute him, how come here they are able to easily locate and pluck him out of his own time stream to assist his future self? That is surely a continuity error, right? Well, obviously the answer here is technological advancement. After apprehending the Second Doctor, the Time Lords worked backwards and mapped out the rest of his timeline leading up to that point, giving them ample earlier moments to cherry-pick from for this emergency scenario. See? Very simple, and I promise this won't come up again later. But yeah, the Second Doctor in The Three Doctors is fine. It's not exactly that deep, but still a decent return for him, and it's fun to have him back. So the Second Doctor's next multi-Doctor appearance came in the form of the 20th anniversary celebration, The Five Doctors. I'm sure y'all know the backstory here. Tom Baker was sulking and refused to come back, and William Hartnell was, well, dust. But it's okay, they got a lookalike and some shelved footage to cover for those two, while Jon Pertwee and Patrick Troughton actually returned to their roles alongside the incumbent Dr. Peter Davison. Narratively, each of the four Doctors spend most of their time in this episode trekking their own separate paths through the wilderness of the Death Zone, each with their own appropriately selected companion character to bounce off of, and in the second Doctor's case, he's accompanied by the Brigadier. Early in the writing process, this role was apparently planned to be filled with either Jamie or Victoria, but both Fraser Hines and Deborah Watling proved unavailable for extensive filming, and so the Brigadier was transplanted from accompanying the third Doctor to the second. It ultimately works out. The two of them have great chemistry, and hot take, I honestly think Lethbridge Stewart was consistently at his best with the second Doctor anyways, so I approve. Plus, in a show-wide context, it is interesting contrasting how this older, grouchier Alastair interacts with this Doctor in comparison to when he was in his prime. As for the second Doctor's actual characterization here, honestly, it's really good. Undoubtedly my favourite of the three Troughton returns. With this being an anniversary special, the second Doctor here has a very nostalgic outlook. Hell, it's his motivation for meeting up with the Brigadier in the first place. And of course he reminisces on old times with the Brig.
And Omega. Don't forget Omega. As if I could. And the terrible Zodin.
Contemplates the history of his people.
In the days before Rassilon, my ancestors had tremendous powers which they misused disgracefully.
And he even recites an old Gallifreyan nursery rhyme to aid him with entering the Dark Tower.
Rassilon's tower would go, must choose above, between, below.
You in pain, Doctor?
He's still humorous, of course, but there's sentimentality in there as well, and that really helps to make this feel like the actual second Doctor, and not just an exaggerated parody. Uncle Terry really delivered the goods here. An interesting scene of note, though, is when the Dark Tower starts conjuring up illusions of past companions to try and deter the separate Doctors from advancing closer into Rassilon's tomb. And in the second Doctor's case, he comes across phantoms of Jamie and Zoe. Fraser Hines was able to free up a day of filming after all, and I assume Wendy Padbury was shipped over in a box labelled fragile, cause look at all that bubble wrap. It's an effective scene, especially how somber it is once the Doctor outs them as fakes and they fade away.
You're gone.
Yes, it's sad.
Oof, I felt that. But it's also at this point where we get an eyebrow-raising detail, and one of the biggest controversies in all of Classic Who. You see, the second Doctor correctly assesses that these aren't the real Jamie and Zoe, because he acknowledges that their memories of their period on the TARDIS were erased by the Time Lords when they were returned to their home time zones. Good job, Doctor. Well observed. But weren't you literally killed right after that happened? He was on trial after all, and immediately after Jamie and Zoe were sent home, the Time Lords reached their verdict and sentenced him to exile on Earth with a forced regeneration. Very swift justice system there, but the point is, if this second Doctor knows about Jamie and Zoe's fate, where in the timeline does he come from? There's no feasible place these current events of his could fit, as he quite literally died after witnessing them go home. So, what's going on here? Well, don't fret. Obviously this is an earlier second Doctor that hasn't actually experienced those events yet. But the big question, of course, is, how does he know about them? Well, allow me to remind you that in the Three Doctors, when two separate incarnations of the same Time Lord are present in the same time zone, they are able to share information with each other telepathically, a point that the Five Doctors itself indirectly calls back to. So, clearly what must have happened here is that the Third Doctor, having had his own experience with the Phantoms concurrently, must have mentally reached out to the Second Doctor at that very moment moment and warned his previous self of the deception by letting him in on this spicy gossip about his own future. It would make sense for him to do so. He does know his other selves are here after all.
Not that little fella in the check trousers and the black frock coat.
And more, there are 5 of you now.
Good grief.
And they're waiting for you.
And it explains why the second Doctor is completely unfazed to see his other selves when he enters the tomb. And him turning up to the Brigadier's party alone at the start? Why, it's certainly not the first time he's told his companions to stay in the TARDIS. Just look at the opening of the Abominable Snowmen. See? Totally logical explanation. Maybe not a perfect square peg in a square hole, but it works pretty well if I do say so myself, and I can certainly think of more ridiculous theories to come up with. And I promise this won't come up again later. Either way, while the majority of multi-Doctor interactions don't happen until near the end, what we do get is great, especially in the second Doctor's case. There's some pleasant chemistry with the fifth Doctor, a nice nod back to the teasing rivalry he had with the third, and it's also just trippy seeing him in the same room with other characters like Sarah Jane Smith. So yeah, I think the second Doctor in the 5 Doctors is a success. Oh boy, now for the 2 Doctors. Ugh. So, Season 22 was a time for structuring story concepts around iconic elements from the show's past. You have Timelash being a sequel to some weird unseen Third Doctor adventure, you get the absolute nightmare of whatever the hell Attack of the Cybermen is trying to do, and even Revelation of the Daleks does this with its continuation of Davros's long-running struggle to ensure Dalek loyalty to him. But in the midst of this already pretty stifling level of fan service, it was decided that Colin Baker's first full year in the role needed a multi-Doctor story. An interesting decision given that this wasn't even commemorating an anniversary or special occasion. Also, the Sontarans are in it for some reason. Patrick Troughton jumped at the opportunity to come back after having relished working on the 5 Doctors so much, and even Fraser Hines returned to accompany him for the full duration of the adventure this time. Now, along with the heavy dose of continuity, Season 22 was also infused with a lot of extreme cynicism. Eric Saywood was script editor after all, and he had already been at this position for almost the entirety of the Davison era, helping to contrast the youthful boyish naivety of the 5th Doctor with the crushing brutality of an unfair universe. But now that the show was being helmed by the brash, antagonistic 6th Doctor, ready to mercilessly tackle this heartless, pessimistic cosmos, well, the bitterness and angst were really dialed up to 11. Why do I mention this? Well, the 2 Doctors in particular might be the embodiment of this, as not only does the story itself contain some gasp-inducingly macabre moments executed with almost frivolous abandon, but even the second Doctor's characterization here is pretty nasty. And to demonstrate what I mean by that, I'm just gonna highlight a point that fellow YouTube critic and girl boss JXE made in the dreaded 5-hour video, which is, he's written to be a bit of a bigot in this story. He strongly opposes Dastari's biological and intellectual augmentation of an androgum called Chasini, because androgums, according to him, are traitorous, greedy barbarians by their very nature, and nothing can change that.
She's still an androgum. You can't change nature.
She's an androgum, Dastari, whatever you may say. She'll snap off the hand that feeds her whenever she feels hungry.
The androgums are barbarians!
And the thing is, this could work. You could salvage this creative choice, but everything about it is executed in pretty much the worst possible way. You could have it so that the Doctor takes umbrage with Dastari's implementation of eugenics, but instead he specifically criticizes the fact that a species he's prejudiced against is more powerful as a result. You could have it so the Doctor is opposed solely to Chasini as an individual, due to her malicious personality, but instead he makes a point about all androgums being this way. Hell, you could even keep the idea of the Doctor having an ugly perspective like this and have it be a springboard for character growth. Hell, just look at what the Curse of Peladon does with the Doctor's attitude towards the Ice Warriors. But given how events go with Chesini resorting to self-serving bloodlust, her fellow androgum Shock-Eye spending the entire runtime lusting after human meat, and even the Doctor himself becoming complicit in immoral behaviour when he becomes influenced by androgum genetics, the narrative seems to ultimately condone and agree with his fears.
I took an androgum, a lowly, unthinking creature of instinct. Try to settle among the gods.
I put myself among the gods.
And as Jay says, it's one thing for the Doctor to take this they're all evil stance against a race like the Daleks, who are allegorically the embodiment of fascism and are literally bred for the one unreasonable desire to kill everything else in the name of purity, but turning that same viewpoint onto a race that seems to showcase actual individuality, and opposing any progression for them because he sees their entire species as naturally bad is a bit eyebrow-raising. And it gets even more ridiculous when you learn that the evil real-world practice that the androgums are meant to be an allegory for is eating meat. So, at the end of the day, this is Robert Holmes taking a potentially progressive stance, and then pushing it so far that it ends up having regressive implications, and that is honestly kind of mesmerising. And 2's weirdly nasty attitude doesn't stop there either.
He's got his head down, Doctor. I can't say I blame him.
I'll thank you not to speak in that appalling mongrel dialect.
What the hell was that? That just fundamentally isn't in character for the Second Doctor at all.
Jamie! You wish to speak to me? Oh no, of course it's not Jamie. You're a comedian.
Well, I don't think you've done a very good job on him.
Why not?
Well, you've lost his Scots accent in the process, so I much preferred the original.
I don't know whether this kind of stuff happens to be the harsher tone of the Sixth Doctor bleeding over, but either way, it does not work coming out of Troughton's Doctor's mouth at all. Now, credit where it's due, that's not to say that there isn't anything of worth here. Pat is able to carry the material, just about, and I do like that moment later on where he tries to goad Stike into setting him free by challenging him to a duel.
Release me, Stike! You are not only without honour, you're a coward as well!
That's pretty on point. There's some nice multi-Doctor chemistry between himself and Colin as well, but it's just a shame that there's really not much of it. And even more of a shame that it's heavily overshadowed by what they get wrong. And all this is only one side of the coin with how badly the 2 Doctors fumbles the ball with the Second Doctor, because now we've got to acknowledge the Time Lord fiasco. So, the reason why the Second Doctor and Jamie are involved in these events in the first place is because they were specifically sent to this space station on a mission by the Time Lords, who were concerned about the time travel experiments going on here. You know, the Time Lords who historically had no connection with or means of tracking down the Second Doctor, and once they did, they pretty much immediately ended his life? Yeah, those Time Lords. This is the 3rd time now that the Second Doctor multi-Doctor stories have had a continuity error. Is he just cursed or something? As with the 3 Doctors, the fact that the Time Lords can directly use the Second Doctor as a lifeline doesn't exactly gel with what the War Games had established, but I was able to just about explain it away then, as at least bringing him in actually made sense for that occasion. It was an emergency for the Time Lords, for the universe at large, and one Doctor alone couldn't handle those odds. Here though, this seems to start out as bog standard reconnaissance with the Second Doctor. Why? This could literally be done with any of the following incarnations and it would make a hell of a lot more sense. On top of that, even little details like the choice of words the Second Doctor has about his current relationship with his people.
I'm a pariah, exiled from Time Lord society. So they can always deny sending me.
The fact that Troughton's hair was deliberately kept grey instead of being dyed to the accurate black, the strange reason they give for Victoria's absence.
I got Victoria to where she wanted to go. Why she wants to learn graphology, I have no idea.
And even the appearance of the TARDIS console room set itself, all these inconsistencies seem to push these events further and further away from the possibility of fitting with the established narrative of the Troughton era. And so, this is where the Season 6B theory comes in. See, if you watch the end of the War Games, you'll notice that we never actually see the Second Doctor change into the Third. The visual effects begin, he spins away facelessly into the darkness, and then next time we see the Doctor, he's stumbling out of the TARDIS at the start of Spearhead from Space with the process already finished. Now, Pertwee hadn't actually been cast when they had filmed Troughton's regeneration scene, hence why no transformation between the two is directly shown. But either way, the creative choice to leave the regeneration scene open-ended creates a sense of ambiguity. Was that really the end of the Second Doctor? I mean, we didn't actually see him regenerate there and then, and with all the weird continuity errors in his following appearances, maybe there's more to this scene than meets the eye. So from there, a hypothesis was formed that maybe the Second Doctor didn't die at the end of the War Games. Maybe the Time Lords, right at the last second, decided instead to have him run errands for them as part of a bargain to postpone his sentence. And they even gave him back Jamie to assist him in some of these missions. Chronologically, all this apparently happens after the War Games episode 10 fades to black, and before the opening of Spearhead from Space episode 1, and retroactively all of the Second Doctor's appearances in these multi-Doctor stories actually serve as glimpses into this mysterious off-screen period of time. I mean, it makes so much more sense now, right? How easily the Time Lords were able to track down the Second Doctor in the Three Doctors? Well, obviously, from his perspective, this is set after his own trial when he's already on their payroll. Doesn't explain the First Doctor's presence, of course, but like, who cares? And it also explains the Second Doctor knowing about Jamie and Zoe's memory loss in the Five Doctors, even though he was supposedly executed immediately after. Cause it turns out he wasn't actually executed right there and then after all. And this is a later Second Doctor taking a break from doing missions for the Time Lords to hang out with his buddy old chum Alistair. And here, in the Two Doctors, we now get to see one of these all-important missions that he's been employed for. A standard diplomatic recon gone wrong that seems exactly like the type they'd put the Third Doctor on in his own era. And hey, there's even official support for this version of events being canonical. Not only were there a series of comics in late '69 that set a precedent for the Second Doctor somehow surviving after his trial, but even Terence Dicks, co-writer of the War Games, endorsed the Season 6B perspective, having written multiple novels with the Second Doctor set in this gap. Even Big Finish helped out by chucking a few audios in there as well. And there's even this non-Doctor Who film called A Hitch in Time that could probably fit pretty snugly in here as well. No. See, that's the terrible thing about the Two Doctors. It handles the Second Doctor's relationship with his own people so abysmally that any other explanation for how this scenario could possibly work is riddled with flaws. So ultimately, it forces you to come to this conclusion, which, sure, while more logically sound, is 100,000 times worse on a creative storytelling level. I despise the idea of Season 6B so goddamn much. It makes a mockery of the ending of the War Games, a mockery of the Second Doctor's sacrifice and regeneration. Yeah, you know how he was meant to have lost everything here? His friends, his body, the freedom to travel to other times and places. Well, if these three multi-Doctor stories truly are examples of events that came afterwards, then they demonstrate that he pretty much got to retain all those things in one way or another, so that's a powerful show-defining character moment carelessly neutered. Additionally, it adds a stupid, unnecessary snag to the Doctor's overall relationship with his own people, and above all, it's completely redundant. But if you want stories where the Time Lords have the Doctor under their thumb and send him on missions to safeguard the universe, you've literally already got the Third Doctor era for that. Hell, even the Fourth Doctor has a few of these. If you want that narrative, go there. The only point of this retroactive off-screen extension of the Second Doctor's timeline is to explain away heinous continuity errors in his multi-Doctor appearances, and that is it. There is otherwise no storytelling benefit. And look, I understand the compulsion to try and make things fit chronologically through conjecture or narrative loopholes, even if they are a complete contradiction of what came before. I did that with the 3 and 5 Doctors earlier in this video after all, but sometimes you've just got to draw the line, especially if something is as shamelessly neglectful of both prior continuity and character journeys as this, and especially if what they're offering in return just plain sucks. Ultimately, I don't care to engage in an analysis of when the Two Doctors truly takes place for the Second Doctor, whether it's after the War Games, or whether it's sometime during Season 5 like that Victoria reference may or may not be trying to imply, because I simply don't think a bitter, out-of-character Second Doctor who is functionally forced to act like the Third for the plot to work, despite it being completely antithetical to his character journey, is worthy of that discussion. Is the emotional impact and sacrifice of the War Games really worth nullifying in favour of trying to accommodate the atrocious continuity errors of a very, very, very not good multi-Doctor story? I don't think so, even if it was Troughton's last performance in the role before his death. Anyway, I've spent far too long on this topic now, so to put it bluntly, the Second Doctor in the Two Doctors doesn't pass the vibe check. It ain't it, Chief, and it should have stayed in the drafts, bestie. So, just because Patrick Troughton departed this mortal plane in 1987, that doesn't mean there was an end to the Second Doctor's multi-Doctor appearances. Whether through archive clips or body doubles, the Cosmic Hobo lived on to continue celebrating anniversaries and sharing the stage with his peers. And the first example of these posthumous appearances came in 1993's Dimensions in... time. So, while the surviving Doctor actors were left to saunter around the EastEnders Albert Square set, or in Tom Baker's case, stand in front of a green screen serving Mike Wazowski vibes, the late Hartnell and Troughton's facial likenesses were replicated with busts, which were then made to spin around the Rani's TARDIS console room to, I guess, convey that she had captured them? I mean, I'm certainly not suggesting that they should have created whole body replicas, god no, but floating decapitated heads, kind of an odd way of going about it, not gonna lie. Obviously this was done to sell the 3D gimmick, but no thanks. Rethink this, besties. Other Second Doctor multi-Doctor appearances include the Name of the Doctor, when Clara is running through the Doctor's time stream and saving him from the corruption of the Great Intelligence, and we see him brush past her in a palm tree pot. Wait a goddamn minute! That ain't no Second Doctor of mine, sonny! And he also appears in The Day of the Doctor, as part of the Saving Gallifrey scene, where he and all the other classic Doctors are represented through archive material, as well as being one of the more, convincing body doubles standing on the cloud at the end. There are some expanded media examples as well, like the novel Heart of TARDIS, which isn't so much a multi-Doctor story, and more so a story that both the Second and Fourth Doctors just so happen to be in. But it does have Victoria's first exposure to rap music, so that's something. There's also the extremely subpar EDA novel, The Eight Doctors, the hilariously bad but endlessly readable Prisoners of Time comic, Big Finish's 50th anniversary celebration, The Light at the End, where Fraser Hines plays him for his brief appearances, another Second and Fourth Doctor crossover in an audio called Return to Telos, Doctors Assemble, and of course, the Early Adventures installment, Daughter of the Gods, which I did a dedicated review of last time, so go check that out. But yeah, that's the Second Doctor's appearances in multi-Doctor stories. Certainly a mixed bag, to put it extremely lightly. At their best, it's like he never went away. At their worst, Let's not go into that again. Something something stream the faceless ones.